Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Imperial Settlers. This is an engine building card game with asymmetric civilizations, tableau building, and just a little bit of burning each other's buildings down. First I'll go over the rules, and then I'll jump into my review. There are two different types of cards in Imperial Settlers. We have faction cards and common cards. Each player is going to pick one of the 4 civilizations to be their faction. We have Romans, Barbarians, Egyptians, and Japanese, and they'll be the only one who gets to draw from that deck. However, everybody is going to be drawing from this very large common card deck. After each player has chosen which civilization they're going to grab this tableau tile that is associated with that civilization and put it right down in front of them. For instance, for the Romans, I would put it right here. And now each player is going to draw 2 cards from the top of the common deck and 2 cards from the top of their specific faction deck to create their starting hand. We're now ready to start the game. There are 4 different phases to each turn, and the first one is the lookout phase. For that phase, the start player is going to reveal cards from the common deck equal to the number of players plus 1. So for instance, if this was a 2-player game, I would reveal 3 cards. Now the starting player gets to pick one of these 3 cards and put them into their hand. So they might take this building here, for instance. Now the second player chooses a card between the remaining 2. They might take this one into their hand, and this final card is going to be discarded. Now we do this one more time. We reveal the 3 cards for our 2-player game, but now we do a reverse player order for picking the cards. So the last player gets to choose which one of these cards they want first. They might take this one, and then the starting player gets to choose again. They might take this one, and this is discarded. Every player now has 6 cards in their hand, the starting 4 they drew, and then the 2 they picked. Phase 2 of each turn involves production. As you see at the top of our tableau board, we have a variety of resources that we're going to make just for being the Romans here. So this is going to be 2 people, 1 sword, a shield, a stick, and a rock, all of which we get now immediately. It's important to note that each of these starting races has differing amounts of base resources that they're going to get for production. Now we're at the 3rd phase of each turn, which is the action phase. At this point, most of the meat of the game is going to happen. Each player, going clockwise from the starting player, is going to take a single action, and they're going to keep going until every single player has taken every action they want to do. So let's take a look at what the action options are. The first thing we can spend an action on is to build a building from our hand of cards. If we look at the top left corner of each card, we have pay to build and some resources. So I could spend 1 wood and 1 rock in order to build this town. So I'd take the rock and the wood, I would spend those to go away, and I would take this card and play it down. Now, there are 2 different zones in each of our civilization areas. We have the common area, which is denoted by the green side of our tableau board, and then for the Romans, we have a gray area here, although that color changes for the different civilizations. So we see that this is a common card. It's got the blue back, so we're going to put it over here, and we can see the green grass kind of matches, which is nice. We also see that this is a production building, and we know that because A, it says production here, but we also have a little road that goes across and then down, but not up. And that kind of matches up nicely with this road that's in line with the production up here. So we always put production buildings in this top level. The moment we build a production building, we actually immediately produce from it. So we see this town produces 2 people. So this is here, and I immediately get to take 2 people from the resource pool and add them in, and I get to use them on this turn. And on subsequent turns, I will be creating 2 people each time we do the production phase. I'm sure you've noticed that we have a feature line, and then we also have an action line in our card tableau. Those are the 2 other types of cards that can be played down. So if you were to build this feature, you would put it in line with the feature row, and then likewise, if you were to build this action, that would go into the action row of your tableau area. This is good because it keeps the various card types organized. We know that when we produce, we only have to look at this top row here and get all the resources on those. Features are kind of triggered conditions, so when one thing happens, you get another thing, or it's a bonus to doing certain actions, so they're ongoing effects. And then actions are cards that can be activated for actions on your turn. So that'll be the second action type that we can do on our turn. We can activate an action building. If we look at the building here, we see it says action, spend 1 person and 1 coin to get 2 victory points. So in this case, we would need to take a person from our resource pool and a coin, well, let's just say I had one. You put them onto the card right there, and then you get the victory points. In this case, we would take our victory point marker and we would go up twice to show that we just got those 2 victory points. The reason we pay for actions by putting resources on them is because you're not allowed to use an action card more than once in a turn unless the card specifically says so. So we have the resources on there. That's going to remind us that we've already done this turn and we can't do it again. The third action type is raising, and that's where we use these raise tokens here. If we look at the cards in our hands, some of them say raise to gain in the top right and some of them don't. The ones that don't are going to be your faction cards, but all of the common cards have this up here. You can spend 1 raise token to the bank in order to get resources equal to the raise to gain portion of the card. Unfortunately, that means you get rid of this card here, but you'll get 2 wood because of that. Those get added into our resource pool. We don't have the raise token anymore, but we have more wood to build more stuff. However, raising a card from your hand to get resources is only one of the 2 ways that you can raise. The other is you can attack opponents. Now, let's pretend for the moment that these Romans are not us, that they're an opponent, we're sitting over there or something like that, and we want to destroy one of their common buildings. We see that it says raise to gain in the top right corner, but this time it's going to take 2 of our raise tokens in order to destroy one of these buildings, as opposed to the 1 token to get it from our hand. When we raise an opponent's building, we are going to get the resources in the top right, so in this case it would be a gold and a wood, but as a consolation prize, the opponent is going to flip that card face over, and they're also going to grab 1 wood from the bank and put it into their resource pool. So this is one of the main ways that you can get into opponents' tableaus and really mess with their engine, but at the same time, they get a little bit out of it. Let's talk quickly about this card that's face up now. We see on the back, we have a little house icon. And you might have noticed that the faction cards we have in our hands are often going to have a little house icon in the pay to build. This means that in order to build our faction cards, they have an extra cost of spending another building. So if I was to build this building, for instance, it is a action building, so I would put it down here on the gray side because it's Roman, but it's going to cost a rock and a house. So let's just say I had a rock here, we spend that, and then you can also spend one of the face down raised buildings to count for the house requirement for building this building. If you don't have any raised buildings, you can still build this faction building, but you're going to have to discard another building as that payment. So you might take this card and get rid of it. You can even discard another faction building if you wanted to, but that's going to be pretty expensive. Getting back to raising, you might have noticed that the faction cards have no raising icon on the top right. That means that you're not allowed to raise opponents' faction cards. Although, if you're playing the Japanese, that's not exactly correct. Most of their buildings can be raised for victory points, but that's one of the asymmetrical bonuses of being the Japanese player. The next action type we can do on our turn involves these faction cards that we have in our hand. If we look at the bottom, it says, make a deal to produce a resource. When you make a deal, you simply pay 1 food, and it's always a food, and then you take this card here, you flip it upside down, and you slide it into the top here where it says deals. At this point, you immediately produce that good because this is in the production area, so that would generate me a food back. And then every time we have a production phase on future turns, we're also going to get resources for every one of the deals that we have made. The final action option that you have available to you on your turn is this one right down here. Now these are all the same on everybody's tableau, and they say spend 2 people to gain a wood, a rock, a food, or a card. This may be played multiple times. So simply put, you can just spend 2 people as a wild resource essentially in order to grab other stuff. The only thing you can't grab from this is gold coins. When you get a card through this 2 people exchange, you can simply draw the top faction card from your deck or the top common card from the main deck. The last thing to note is this little shield icon. Now this is a resource that we grabbed from our first production because it's on our little tableau here. However, unlike the rest of them in the game, you only ever have 1 shield, so you don't produce more each turn. On your turn, you can put this down on any of the common cards that you have available to you, and this increases the raise cost for that card by 1. So if an opponent wanted to raise this card here, it's going to cost them 3 raise tokens instead of the usual 2 because the shield is on there. The action phase is going to continue until every player has done every action that they want to do on their turn. They might be out of cards or out of resources, but once everybody has passed, we move on. The 4th phase of each turn is cleanup, and this is pretty simple. If we see the middle of our tableau board, it says you may store any number of swords. Now this is the Roman only bonus, so the Romans would keep all the swords they want, but they're going to lose every other resource, all excess resources that they were not able to spend on that turn. Each of the other factions saves all of a different resource, so the Japanese save all their food, the barbarians save all their people, and the Egyptians save all of their gold coins. Once every player has discarded all the resources that they're not allowed to save, we pass the starting player token to the left and begin the next turn. On the score track, we can indicate this by going from the first turn to the second turn location. If you notice there are 5 different turn spots, this means that the game is going to be 5 overall turns long. Once we have done 5 full turns, we evaluate to see who has the most victory points. We've already accrued victory points on the track throughout the game by raising cards or activating buildings that give us victory points. At the end of the game, we also get victory points for our buildings. All of our common buildings are going to give us 1 victory point. We see this little star in the side. and all of our faction buildings are going to give us 2 victory points. We see 2 stars over there. Once you add all that together, you see who has the most victory points. That player is the winner. If there's a tie, then the most resources breaks it. If there's still a tie, most cards in hands breaks it. And if there is still a tie, then, well, they get to share the victory. For my review of Imperial Settlers, I'm going to explain my thoughts on each item of this list, starting at the top and working my way down. So let's start with the positives. And the first of these is the tactical hand puzzle that this game presents each player with. You have so many different things that you can do with the cards in your hand. You have somewhat mundane buildings, but they usually give you resources. You have very interesting, specific action buildings, and you can make very cool combos where this building does this building, and because I did this, I get to do that. But you have to find your way through your hand to make that happen. Looking at the resources you have available in front of you and maybe deciding which cards you might raise to get those resources to build other cards. You might turn certain cards into deals. There's so many different ways to evaluate your hand. You really need to think about which cards are going to turn into buildings and how am I going to get to the end of each one of the 5 turns having the least amount of wasted resources, because it really is an efficiency puzzle to use everything to the best you can, because you're going to lose almost all of your resources at the end of each turn. And I always enjoy that kind of mechanic in games. I think this game does a very good job of having that awesome puzzle that you need to kind of figure your way through. And the other positive involves those 4 civilizations that the players get to choose from at the beginning of each game and play as. Now, they are asymmetric. They play somewhat differently from each other. Specifically, the kind of synergies that they have in each of these different civilizations varies quite wildly, and honestly, all of them feel kind of overpowered in their own right. So as you're playing each race, you can tend to feel like you have somewhat of an unfair advantage, but it kind of feels like everybody else has a similar feeling to that. That's not going to happen every single game, but they get to do some really cool stuff. You know, for instance, the Egyptians get to save gold, and they make tons of gold, and gold is a wild resource, so it feels like they can just do whatever they want because they have all this resource and they're not really restricted in any of those ways. Versus the Romans that have amazing building synergy. They build buildings that give them bonuses when they build other buildings, and it seems like once they get to the mid-game, they can't do anything without getting victory points because of the synergies that they built up. The Japanese are just really powerful, but their buildings can be destroyed. The barbarians have people like crazy, and they can just spend them as resources, and they can raise all over the place, so they all have their own thing going for them, and all of those are fun. It seems like they're balanced relatively well. I've seen each of the civilizations win. I've seen games where the Egyptians look like they're amazing. They have all this gold, they're just steamrolling like crazy, but then the Romans just clean them out because they had a more efficient victory point generating engine. Even though they weren't doing the flashy cool thing, they played a little better and a little bit more focused, and they were able to win even though this other thing looked amazing. So I really like how all the asymmetric civilizations fit together into the game. I think it's definitely one of the big strong points for it. Neutral point number 1 has to do with downtime due to analysis paralysis. Now, I mentioned already that I really like the puzzle that the hand gives you of you trying to value which cards you want to play and how you're going to do that, how you're going to use all these resources efficiently. What I don't love is when I've kind of figured out what my plan is and an opponent takes 5 or 6, 7 more minutes to figure out theirs, because maybe they have this huge hand, they have this massive amount of resources, and they feel like they got to use them efficiently because the game penalizes you so hard for saving resources. Well, you don't get to save almost any of them. You really want to use all of them, and you want to use those cards in your hand the correct way, and you can kind of spiral down into this analysis paralysis black hole, and it's not fun for the other people at the table. You know, it might take them all those minutes to even take their first action because it can have very real ramifications, and then it comes back around to them and they might take another several minutes because maybe they drew a card and that might have changed their plan, and I don't love that part of it. Now, this definitely hits people who are susceptible to analysis paralysis quite hard. If you are not, then it's not as big of a deal. That's why this isn't really a negative. It's definitely player dependent, but the game enables that analysis paralysis a little more than I necessarily like. Neutral number 2 has to do with card draw and how overly important it seems to be to the game in order to play well. The first time you play the game, you're not really going to think about it too much and you're going to play it, and that's okay. But the second and third time, you're going to really realize all those times where you had resources you couldn't spend because you used all the cards in your hand, you need to get more cards in your hand. You have that deck of the faction deck that has 30 cards in it, and that has all those awesome, potentially overpowered tools in it that work so well together. So you got to start spending 2 people to draw that card and spend 2 more people to draw that card. Did you draw a card that lets you draw more cards? You better play that. And then draw more cards, and you get this huge hand of cards, and you have this huge amount of resources, and it leads directly into neutral point number 1 that I already mentioned. it feeds into that analysis paralysis situation, and I wish there was less ways to draw cards in the game so that you could have it more centered around how you're specifically playing the cards you necessarily have and the cards you have face down in front of you, more so than the cards that you have not quite gotten yet, and that constant drive to get more cards in your hand to spend everything well. Neutral number 3 has to do with the balance between faction cards and common cards when they're out there on your tableau. What I found is that people tend to get rid of their common cards very quickly in order to convert them over into faction cards, because faction cards are where their awesome stuff is, and thematically that makes tons of sense. You really want to get into those great Roman cards, but mechanically it means that people tend to have almost no common cards out in front of them. They just burn them oftentimes after not even really using them in order to get those good faction cards going. And you look at a table of people playing and it feels, I don't know, a little bit bland, seeing this humongous sea of faction cards and almost none of the generic ones. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that those faction cards are worth 2 victory points each and the common cards are only worth 1. I kind of wish that maybe the faction cards were just worth 1 victory point, or some of them were 2, but not all of them were, because that would make you really think about if you want to get rid of that card to upgrade the action or the ability that's necessarily on that action, whereas usually it seems like a no-brainer. Like, yeah, get rid of that card, place this down, it's worth more points than that one was, and it's going to have better things going on it. So I wish there was a little more incentive to balance both sides of your player tableau instead of having it all shifted over to one side, but it doesn't necessarily hurt the game overall. It's just kind of a nitpick. And now for the one negative. And simply put, I think this game has too many actions in it. Now, not action types, but overall action opportunities that are presented to you in the game. On that first turn, you might do like 4 or 5 actions, and that feels good. You're building a building, you're getting a couple resources, that was good. The second turn, you might take 7 or 8 actions, and that feels really good. Okay, great. That third turn, you're taking 14 actions, and that fourth turn, you're taking like 23 actions, and it just can explode. And this is if you are playing well. I mean, obviously, if you're not playing very well, you are going to be taking far less actions than other players, and that is also a problem. So if you are that person who's playing well and you have like 20 actions available to you on this turn where you're building this action and getting that card and doing this and raising that to do this and taking this and trading this in, that just makes your mind explode with that analysis paralysis that I talked about already. The flip side is if you're not doing very well, or maybe you got really unlucky. I don't think luck is that big of a deal, but if you have found yourself in a situation where you spent all the 4 cards you have in your hand, and you look across the table and that person has a mound of resources still, and they've got like 8 to 10 cards still in their hand, you realize it might be 15 minutes before you get another action, because they're just going to keep doing actions and they're going to keep thinking, because they're like, wait, oh, if I do this and if I do as a gold instead, wait, no, if I do that instead, and it really slows down, and now you don't even have a hand of cards in front of you to strategize about what you're going to be doing on the next turn. You are just waiting. You may as well just leave the room and then come back in once that person says they're done. I wish there was some way to rein in the crazy amount of actions that this game generates near the mid to late game. I think that 2 things really feed into that. One is the fact that when you build those production buildings, you immediately produce out of it. Oftentimes, you get exactly what you spent, or even better, you might spend 1 wood and get 2 wood back out of it, which just perpetuates this engine that can just explode. And on top of that, the other thing is there is no penalty for somebody taking way more actions than anybody else. Now, I'm not trying to fix the game. I'm not going to like house rule it and say, oh, well, you can only take 1 more action after somebody passes, because that really is going to stifle another person. The game is not designed around that, but I wish it had been designed around the idea where once somebody passes, other people kind of have a clock where they need to really consider how much more they can actually get done. They are not going to get to do every single option that they have presented in front of them, because that just makes the game take too long overall, and it makes downtime be a problem. And now let's talk about replayability. The game comes with 4 different factions that are completely different. Their faction decks have no similar cards between them, but at the same time, you are playing the same game no matter what faction you are, and you are still kind of focusing on some of those things I talked about in the neutral section, on like getting card draw. You're still really trying to fill your hand up, and you're trying to convert those common buildings into faction buildings as soon as you can, pretty much no matter what faction you are. However, you are going to find yourself really gunning down different synergies and different focuses for the game, depending on which faction you're going to play. So there's definitely some differentiation there. I think that as you play specific factions, you're going to get significantly better at them, which is kind of cool. You might find yourself 3 or 4 plays in, and you'll probably go from being like, ooh, that's a new card, I didn't really know how that worked, to I really need this card and that card, and I'm gonna build this amazing thing. So you switch over from shiny to like really well-honed machine, and I think that a person who's played this game like 10 or 12 times will probably destroy someone who's only played the game 2 or 3 times. There's definitely a skill area for this game for each of the different players. So if it's a game that you find yourself enjoying for a couple plays, then I could see yourself getting a ton of replayability out of it. However, if you've played it a couple times and it's like, it's enjoyable, then you might find yourself only playing it, 8 or so times, each faction maybe twice. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. And now let's talk about player count. The game plays 1 to 4 players, and I've done all of those except the 4. Now, the 1, I can't really speak to it too much. I enjoyed myself playing that solitaire game, but I don't play solitaire games very often enough to really have an opinion as to how it stacks up. It was okay, but I really want to talk about the multiplayer aspect. I think that 2-player is the best option for this game for probably obvious reasons based on the things I've said before. Downtime and analysis paralysis are much smaller when you only have one opponent. If you take an action, then they take an action, then you take an action, back and forth, you're going to have much less time where you're waiting for your opponents to do stuff. I have played 3-player games, and they worked. It's kind of cool having multiple civilizations going. If somebody's doing really well, you could try to have 2 people kind of attack them and slow them down. But the downtime really started to get in the way there. I mean, the 3-player games took over 2 hours for my play group, and I felt like I did not want it to go that long. I could see myself playing a 3-player game again, but I'm going to hopefully play with specific people who know the game already and maybe aren't necessarily prone to analysis paralysis. I have not played the 4-player game, and that is by choice. I've seen how slow the game can be with that 3-player game. I don't think I want to try a 4-player game. I'm worried it'll go well over 3 hours and definitely overstay its welcome. Now, if you're playing with people who are very anti-analysis paralysis, you could totally get a 4-player game in probably 2 hours if people are really going for it, maybe even a little bit less. But they're not going to be playing at the level that the game is beckoning you to play. It's saying, be efficient, do amazing stuff with that hand, and it really pulls you in to those really long play sessions. Fortunately, as I said, 2-player plays very well. There's only so much punching back and forth you can do to opponent. There's quite a bit of an multiplayer solitaire since you can only raise the opponent's buildings, and oftentimes you want to spend those raise tokens to get cards out of your hand to get better resources. It can be slightly more efficient. So I really like the 2-player game, and I don't necessarily recommend it for too much more than that. In conclusion, I came into Imperial Settlers with incredibly high expectations. I was very, very excited because I love the inherent ideas of it, of asymmetric civilizations. I love that hand of cards and figuring out you spend cards to play cards and which cards are more important. I love that stuff. But my excitement was very much tempered by how kind of too deep the game ended up being for me. Too long, too many actions, too much synergy, and too much focus on being hyper efficient. It really smacks you down by you losing all those resources, and it really wants you to use all those resources and feel awesome because you have this amazing efficiency engine. And I don't necessarily want it to be a 2+ hour game almost every time I play it. In a 2-player setting, I've seen it go a little bit over an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and that's okay in certain settings, but I found it pretty hard to get to the table, honestly, especially after the first few times when I played it with some of the people in my game group. In general, people have enjoyed it. In fact, only one person has actively disliked it, but it's hard to get it on the table with the play time that it takes and also the amount of brain space it takes. I love that puzzle, but it's a little bit too big of a puzzle, usually. You really find yourself investing in a lot of mental energy. It's not a light game at all. That cover with all the cute, awesome artwork, I really like the artwork, really kind of makes you feel like this is gonna be a 60 to 90 minute game and not this quite deep, skill-driven, also a little bit of luck-driven game, and it just didn't end up being exactly what I wanted. At the end, I definitely recommend this game for people who like that challenge, who like that deep, awesome gameplay, and specifically people who like 2-player games. I think that some people will enjoy the 4-player game, but it really shines with that 2-player game. I feel like you should give this game a shot, but definitely understand the kind of time commitment and brain commitment that you are setting yourself up for. I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you'd like to see more like it, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.